bottom end of the confidence interval, medium end of the confidence interval, wherever, is still a catastrophic event that's happening to the population. So I think that in general we've had considerably more credibility. Just a little bit of a side, which I actually haven't mentioned before, but one of my students, former students, works with the USAID office in Washington in the headquarters, and USAID is one of the principal funders of cluster surveys around the world. And when this report first came out, it was sent from some department, which I don't remember, immediately to USAID saying, USAID, you know about cluster surveys, please discredit this one. And so I talked to several people who had been there, and they said, well, you destroyed our whole Friday afternoon. We spent our whole Friday afternoon with this, and in the end we sent the message back saying, this looks like a credible survey. So I think that at some level there's an appreciation of the methodology and so forth. One of the things that I found a little discouraging was that much of the press did not take the time to really think through these issues, and we tried to present it in the Lancet as straightforward as we could. And I think in some areas we summarized things perhaps a little bit more than we should have, and people tried to read between the lines and see things that really weren't there. As far as valid criticisms, I think anytime you're doing a survey where you're limited in the number that you can do and maintain the safety of your team, you'd always like to have more data, and that would help you to be a bit more precise on things. I think the thing that really concerns me more than anything else is this issue of migration. And that when we take this process forward to think about how to do better jobs in the future, that's one of the technical issues that we're going to have to think about in a big way, is how to deal with these migration issues.
Please. Yes, you.
So full disclosure, I've been to Iraq and I run a documentary video project with some Iraqis there. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, you mentioned that when you go to a house next door, close houses have similarities. I wonder, as you probably know, in Baghdad, there's a lot of neighborhoods that are very insular. So you have a whole sort of type of people in one area. Rather than just a few houses, whole areas sort of closed off. And yes, they travel other places. But I wonder if you talk a little bit about how that affected things. And then also, I think it's really important what this gentleman said about the population, because the numbers in 2003 vary from something like 22 million to 27 million. So if you want to talk about confidence intervals, it's pretty large. That said, just talking about mortality rates, I think is really important. And we don't necessarily have to say, this is how many people actually die. So I just wonder if you could talk a little about the communities, and also whether what you see it says cancer and infant mortality related to radiation in certain areas of the country.
Okay. Well, we had some criticism about the baseline crude mortality, which the first time we found was 5, second time we found was 5.5. People had the impression that it should be much higher, considering all the events that Iraq has been through, the problem with the public utilities and so forth. However, we got the number twice, so and it's fairly close to the estimates from the U.S. Census Bureau, which I think is 5.6 or 5.7, and that's also in the CIA fact book, although other people have different numbers. But if you look at the crude mortality rates for the neighborhood, if you look at Kuwait and Jordan and Syria and Iran and so forth, they're all about the same anyway. So it's generally in that area. It's a bit higher. Well, that might shift the numbers up a bit, but I think we're basically in that particular area. Now, clustering is a problem, but mathematically you can calculate the clustering itself. So you can see what is the probability that these houses are very similar to each other. And when you design a cluster survey, you assume what we call a design effect of 2. So you double the size that you would normally have for that number of households if it were just randomly selected. So it turned out our design effect was 1.6. So there was not as much clustering effect as we had anticipated in the design. Saying that, there was one cluster, and I don't even remember where it exactly was geographically, where there had been a number of deaths from a car bomb right in that particular area. So this is a risk, and this can skew the numbers, and there's no doubt about that. If we had the opportunity to do a bigger sample size, I'd be a bit more confident. If we could spread those clusters out a bit more, for the same reason you say, very insular neighborhood, but that's a problem all over the world. That's not just unique to Baghdad. You know, a bit more confident. But I think from a kind of a public health practice side of things, that the results stand fairly strongly on their own. I don't really have problems with that. Migration is a key issue which we could come back to and talk more. We need to address.
Okay, you please, yes.
Just in terms of credibility, I think the biggest complaint I've heard is about your refusal to release the data.
Yeah.
It would make it impossible for an outside researcher to sort of replicate the results, look at the computer code and whatnot. But leaving that issue to one side.
I want to talk about that one first before you go to your second question. Because our team in Iraq was very nervous about all of this. In fact, Riyadh went into hiding immediately afterwards, then went off to Amman for a while to keep his head down. He felt even unsafe there, and he felt in the end he's just as vulnerable in Amman as he is in Baghdad, and so then he went back. So we agreed that in the beginning, at his request, we would not share the data. But we had the intent of sharing it all along, eventually. So what we're doing in the process now is removing any identifiers that would give suggestions to which neighborhood. And we plan in the near future to release this to selected universities and other groups that have, we believe, the capacity to analyze these in an unbiased and straightforward manner. So it's our intent to do this. Okay, now you can go with the other question.
The question was about, could you give a little detail on the random sampling nature of the process? Because that's the other sort of most plausible criticism I've heard.
Right. Well, I think, first off, we had criticism of sampling, but the fact that the rates so closely parallel each other suggests very strongly to me that this system that we used of random sampling the streets was virtually identical with using the GPS units.
But just the details of that.
Okay.
You picked an address and you said to the Iraqi team, okay, go to this address, or were they actually?
No, they actually did the selections there. We put together the ground rules for this. We agreed the ground rules for doing this, and this is not a lot different than we would do in, you know, whether we're looking for measles immunization coverage in urban Lusaka or something. So
They had a laptop computer, and they pressed a button, and they randomly generated a street.
no, they did it on paper. They did it on a piece of paper. They'd write down the street numbers on pieces of paper, and then they would randomly pick out one of those from the hat, as it were, the things that we were doing in the 1960s. They did that. We got criticism because at the end of the process, they destroyed all the little pieces of paper, which, you know, I think most of us would have done anyway, but that was thought by some to be evidence that we should have kept. On the other hand, we felt from an ethical standpoint, we promised to eliminate all unique identifiers, and that was a unique identifier that we should eliminate.
And then they went to the house.
Okay. Well, then once they selected the streets, then they numbered the houses on that street from 1 to wherever the end of the street was. And then they randomly, using serial numbers on money, they randomly selected a start number and started with that house. And then from that, they went to the nearest front door, nearest front door, nearest front door, until they had a total of 40 houses.
And so sometimes the house in the neighborhood was too dangerous in their view, and then they went to
They had the option to say, if the neighborhood was too dangerous, then you could either come back or you could select another one. Now, where this was a real problem was in Basra. And they had to go to Basra 3 or 4 times before it was finally safe enough to go. But they decided that they were going to go to the neighborhood that was selected, even if it was a bit dangerous at the moment. They'd come back and do that one. They wanted to stick with the one that was selected. Now, in one case, they decided that this was just too dangerous to go to, and they were going to select another neighborhood. And there were rules about this, that if this neighborhood was too dangerous and you decided you couldn't sample that way, you went to the nearest neighborhood or community or village or whatever that was similar to this one. And so in this case, they went to the next one and they sampled that one. But it turned out afterwards that the replacement one was across the border into another government. So we dropped it from the analysis.
bias the rates down.
Yeah, exactly.
The bias in doing that would not have inflated it. It had to be downwards. So that's a nonsense of a
Well,
criticism.
I mean, so let's get back to the Oxford physicists and their sort of take on things. And their claim is that depending on, it depends on sort of the composition of the survey team. The survey team is all Sunnis. You know, maybe certain neighborhoods that they're more likely to feel safe going into and certain answers that may be different. If the survey team is all Kurds, then it'd be different. And in terms of which, are they more likely to go to a neighborhood that is completely safe, controlled by the government, or a neighborhood that's contested, or a neighborhood that's more controlled by insurgents?
Okay.
So again, that's not.
So we may come back to this. I'm watching. Raj, you're next.
Question being asked of me.
Okay, moving on, sir, you.
Yes, I was struck by the 92% of the people that had death certificates.
Yeah.
Does that imply that sometime in the future there will be a source of data available to get a lot of these questions?
That's a very good point because, and I was struck by this in the beginning, and the tradition has been that you had to have a death certificate because, first off, you couldn't be buried unless you had a death certificate. Secondly, if you were to get any kind of unemployment benefits or termination or the family, any kind of inheritance or anything, you had to have a piece of paper for it. So it became a very ingrained process. And you got these basically from the public hospital. Sometimes the public hospitals would give you a death certificate without seeing the body, but almost always they had to see the body, with the exception for adults. For children, not always the case. And these forms were filled out in duplicate or triplicate. One of them went to the person, one stayed in the facility, and one in the past went to the bureau that handled vital registration. There was a suggestion now that families would routinely pay a little bit of money under the table to not pass on the certificate to anyone if it were a contested area or something that would make them a target in any way. So I think the evidence is now that death certificates are still being done, but they're not moving up the system in any way.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for your work. My question is, you showed a table where indicating that in World War I, 14% of deaths in conflict were civilians, and the number steadily increased, the percent. Now it's in the 90th percent. What's your understanding of the reasons for that increase in civilian deaths as a percent of all deaths in conflict?
Well, I think probably one of the major one has to do with the use of air power, and the Pentagon makes a claim, and I'm sure they're right, that weapons have a much higher precision now than they had in the past. It doesn't necessarily mean that the intelligence on the ground is of the same level. In fact, one of Les Roberts' friends was actually involved in targeting airstrikes in the early days of this war, and he mentioned that they would look at aerial photographs and they would see in front of a house there were no cars yesterday, and today there were 2 cars, so there was obviously a meeting going on, and they bombed the house. So that's the kind of level of intelligence that may go into some of the targeting. So I think basically it's missiles, it's air power, it's things like cluster bombs. The basic technology of this has expanded so rapidly that I would say that's a major reason.
Please.
If you go back to the non-violent death rates, I was wondering whether your sample allows you to focus on the most vulnerable. I was thinking of infants or maybe children below 5 and the elderly. What would we see if you were able to look at death rate, age-specific?
There's not enough data to do age-specific death rate. That is a very good question, and if one were to do a survey in a more peaceful situation, that was the first thing that I think you want to look at, because there's been a lot of issues about deaths among children, both under Saddam and then post-invasion, which numbers to use. There's no question that the numbers were manipulated. In fact, I think they've been manipulated by everybody, and so without starting over again, I don't think we'd have a good idea. So that would be a number one thing that I think we'd want to do.
Great. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Doctor, I was wondering, I think there was an article in Mother Jones claiming that the Iraqi